Kethivore had spent 40 cycles watching aliens kill each other. It was his job. The Valanthi hegemony paid him well to sit in observation posts across the galaxy and take notes while other species fought and died. He had seen over 200 civilizations wage war. He had watched empires rise and fall. He had documented every weapon, every tactic, every desperate last stand that lesser beings could imagine. He was very good at his job, and he was very bored. The assignment to observe humans had come 3 days ago. Kethivore had read the preliminary files during his journey to the observation post and found nothing interesting. Humans were a young species. They had only discovered faster-than-light travel 30 of their years ago, which was nothing in galactic terms. Their ships were slow and poorly armed. Their bodies were soft and weak. They needed to sleep for a third of every day cycle and could die from something as simple as bad water or extreme temperatures. Kethivore had written his preliminary assessment before even arriving at the observation post. Humans were not a threat. They were barely worth studying. The only reason the High Council had sent him was because humans had been expanding quickly, establishing colonies on dozens of worlds in a short time. The Council wanted to know if they should be concerned. They should not be concerned, Kethivore had decided. Humans were fragile creatures who would break easily when the hegemony decided to expand into their territory. His observation post hung in orbit above a world the humans called Kepler 442b. It was a small planet with thin air and cold temperatures, but the humans had built a colony there anyway. 12,000 of them lived in a settlement they had named New Haven. They had farms and schools and hospitals. They had families and children and elderly people who sat in the sun and told stories about Earth. Kethivore thought it was pathetic. These creatures had traveled across the stars only to recreate the same simple lives they had left behind. They had no ambition, no vision, no understanding of their place in the cosmic order. He activated his long-range sensors and began his observations. The colony's leader was a man named Jake Morrison. Kethivore pulled up his file and found nothing impressive. Jake was 53 years old. He had served in something called the Earth Defense Forces for 20 years before retiring. He had come to the frontier seeking quiet and peace. He had a wife who had died 2 years ago and a daughter who lived on another colony world. Jake spent his days resolving disputes between farmers and approving construction permits. He was a bureaucrat, not a warrior. Kethivore made a note that the colony's leadership would collapse quickly under pressure. The security chief was more interesting but still unremarkable. Her name was Katie Reyes, and she was only 28 years old. She had trained as a soldier before transferring to colonial service. She was fit and capable, but she commanded a force of only 300 armed personnel. Most of them were volunteers with minimal training. They had outdated weapons and no heavy equipment. Kethivore calculated that the colony could field perhaps 500 fighters if they armed every able-bodied adult. It would not matter. 500 humans with primitive guns could not stand against a real military force. And a real military force was coming. The Draxians had been tracking human expansion for months. They were a warrior species who had built their civilization on conquest and slavery. They raided weaker worlds, captured their populations, and sold them across the galaxy. They had done this for thousands of years, and they had never failed to take what they wanted. A Draxian fleet was approaching Kepler 442b at that very moment, 15 warships carrying 4,000 warriors. Their commander was a scarred veteran named Vexwrath who had conquered over 30 worlds. He was efficient and brutal and utterly without mercy. Kethivore had observed the Draxians before. He knew exactly how this would unfold. Vexwrath would broadcast a surrender demand. The humans would either comply and become slaves, or they would resist and be slaughtered. Either way, the colony would fall within hours. Kethivore had seen it happen dozens of times with dozens of species. He settled into his chair and prepared to take notes. This would be routine work. He might even finish early and have time to review the data before sending his report to the High Council. On the planet below, Jake Morrison was reviewing supply reports when his communications officer ran into his office. The young man was pale and breathing hard. He told Jake that long-range sensors had detected a fleet approaching. Not human ships. Unknown configuration. Coming fast. Jake stood slowly. He walked to the window and looked out at the colony he had helped build. Children were playing in the central square. Farmers were bringing in the morning harvest. An old woman was feeding birds near the fountain. It was a peaceful scene, full of life and hope. Jake's hands did not shake. His voice did not waver. He simply nodded and told the communications officer to sound the alert. Then he walked to his quarters and opened a locked case that he had not touched in 3 years. Inside was a rifle that his grandfather had carried in a war on Earth long ago. It was old and scratched and had killed many enemies in its time. Jake checked the weapon, loaded it, and walked back outside. Katie Reyes met him in the corridor. She had already heard the news. Her face was calm, but her eyes were hard. She asked Jake what he wanted to do. He told her to gather everyone who could fight. She nodded and left without another word. Within minutes, sirens were wailing across New Haven. People stopped what they were doing and looked up. Parents grabbed their children. Workers put down their tools. Everyone knew what the sirens meant. They had drilled for this possibility, though most had hoped it would never come. The colony had no warships capable of fighting a real fleet. They had no heavy weapons or defensive shields. They had only themselves, their small arms, and whatever they could build or improvise in the time they had left. Kethvor watched the humans scramble and felt a flicker of pity. These creatures had no idea what was coming. The Draxians would sweep through their little settlement like fire through dry grass. The humans would scream and beg and die, and then the survivors would be put in chains and dragged away to spend the rest of their short lives in suffering. It was the way of the galaxy. The strong consumed the weak. The humans were weak, and they would be consumed. Kethvor began recording. He would document every moment of their destruction, and then he would move on to his next assignment. That was his job. That was all there was. He did not know yet how wrong he was about everything. The Draxian fleet arrived in orbit above Kepler 442b exactly when Kethvor's calculations had predicted. 15 warships arranged themselves in standard assault formation, their weapons charged and ready. They were beautiful in a terrible way, all sharp angles and dark metal, built for one purpose only. Vexrath broadcast his ultimatum on all frequencies. His voice was deep and cold. He told the humans that they had 1 standard hour to surrender. If they complied, they would be taken as slaves but allowed to live. If they resisted, they would be exterminated down to the last child. He had given this speech many times before. Most species started weeping within minutes. Kethvor adjusted his sensors to focus on the colony below. He wanted to capture the moment when hope died in the humans' eyes. It was always the same. First came denial, then fear, then desperate pleading. Some species tried to negotiate. Some tried to hide. Some simply collapsed and waited to die. The humans did none of these things. Jake Morrison stood in the central square and addressed his people. His voice carried across the entire colony through the speaker system. Kethvor listened carefully, expecting the usual mix of false courage and hidden terror. Jake spoke simply. He told his people that enemies were coming. He told them that these enemies wanted to take their children and make slaves of their families. He told them that surrender meant chains and suffering and death far from home. Then he asked a single question. Would anyone like to fight? Every hand in the colony went up. The elderly and the young, the farmers and the teachers, the doctors and the engineers, mothers holding babies raised their free hands. Men who could barely walk stood tall and volunteered. Even some of the older children stepped forward before their parents gently guided them back. Kethvor felt the first flicker of surprise. This was not normal. When faced with overwhelming force, most species fragmented. Some wanted to fight, some wanted to flee, some wanted to surrender. Arguments broke out, factions formed, unity collapsed under the weight of fear. But these humans stood together without hesitation. Not a single voice called for surrender. Not a single person tried to flee. They simply raised their hands and waited for instructions. Katie Reyes took command of the defense with cold efficiency. She had studied urban warfare during her training, and she knew that their only chance was to make the enemy pay for every step. She divided the colony into sectors and assigned defenders to each one. She identified choke points where small numbers could hold against larger forces. She planned ambush positions and kill zones and fallback routes. The colonists worked faster than Kethvor thought possible. They moved furniture and vehicles to create barricades. They dug trenches and set traps. They turned their homes and shops into fortresses. The schoolhouse became a medical station. The warehouse became an armory. The church became a command center. Kethvor watched a man named Danny Ortiz, a farmer who had never fired a weapon in anger, practice reloading his rifle until his fingers bled. He watched a woman named Maria Santos, a grandmother of 7, carefully prepare explosive charges from mining supplies. He watched teenagers carry ammunition to defensive positions while their parents checked weapons and said goodbye to each other. The humans were not panicking. They were preparing. What disturbed Kethvor most was the smiling. These people should have been terrified. They were facing certain death or slavery. Yet many of them smiled as they worked. Not happy smiles, but grim smiles of determination. Some even laughed as they embraced their families for what might be the last time. An old man named Pete Dawson, who had fought in wars on Earth decades ago, sat on a bench cleaning an ancient shotgun. A young woman asked him if he was afraid. Pete looked up at her with clear eyes and shook his head. He told her that he had lived a good life. He had seen his children grow up. He had held his grandchildren. If today was his day to die, then he would die well. He would take as many of these alien bastards with him as he could. The young woman laughed and loaded her own weapon. When the hour ended, Jake Morrison stood before a communications screen and recorded his response to the Draxians. His face was calm. His voice was steady. He did not beg or plead or try to negotiate. He said 3 words, "Come and take them." Then he cut the transmission and walked to his position at the barricades. The Draxians landed their assault craft on the outskirts of New Haven. The craft touched down in perfect formation, and the warriors poured out in disciplined ranks. They were massive creatures, standing over 2 meters tall, covered in natural armor that could stop most weapons. Their plasma rifles hummed with deadly energy. They had trained for combat since birth and knew nothing else. Vexarath expected the usual resistance. A few brave fools would shoot at his warriors and die quickly. Then the civilians would scatter and hide, and his troops would hunt them down like animals. The whole operation would take perhaps an hour. The Draxians advanced into the colony in standard formation. They moved through the outer streets, their sensors scanning for targets. The buildings around them were silent. The streets were empty. No movement anywhere. One of the officers reported that the humans had fled. Perhaps they were hiding in the central buildings. Perhaps they had already given up. The Draxians pushed deeper into the settlement, relaxed and confident. They turned a corner into the main street. The world exploded. Gunfire erupted from 17 different positions. Windows, rooftops, doorways, basements. The humans had let the Draxians walk into the center of their kill zone before opening fire. The first volley cut down 30 warriors before they could react. The Draxians scrambled for cover, firing back at the hidden positions. Their plasma bolts burned through walls and shattered windows. But the humans were already moving, falling back through prepared routes to new positions, firing as they went. Kethvor watched a Draxian warrior charge toward a human position. The human, a thin man named Greg Palmer, who had been an accountant 3 hours ago, stood his ground and fired. His bullet punched through the warrior's armored skull and dropped him instantly. That should not have been possible. Kethvor knew Draxian physiology. Their chitin could stop plasma bolts at medium range. A simple metal projectile should have bounced off without effect. He ran a quick analysis and felt his blood chill. The humans had modified their weapons. They had overcharged the propellants and reinforced the barrels. They were firing projectiles at velocities that should have destroyed the guns in their hands. The recoil alone should have shattered their bones, but they kept firing, absorbing the punishment, killing Draxians with every shot. These soft, fragile creatures were not fighting like prey. They were fighting like something else entirely. The battle for New Haven entered its 3rd hour, and Kethvor had stopped taking analytical notes. He was simply watching, unable to look away from his screens. The Draxians had brought 4,000 warriors to this colony. They had expected to crush 12,000 soft, weak humans in minutes. Instead, they were dying in the streets, falling to primitive weapons wielded by farmers and teachers and shopkeepers. The humans fought in ways that Kethvor had never documented before. They did not hold static positions until they were overrun. They did not break and flee when outnumbered. They moved constantly, attacking from unexpected angles, vanishing before the Draxians could respond, appearing somewhere else to strike again. A young man named Ryan Costa led a team of 8 civilians through the sewers beneath the colony. They emerged behind a Draxian formation and opened fire, killing a dozen warriors before disappearing back underground. The Draxians sent troops after them, but the tunnels were filled with traps. 30 more warriors died in the darkness before Vexwrath ordered his forces to stay above ground. Ryan was 20 years old. He had been studying engineering at the colony's small college. He had never killed anyone before today. By the end of the 3rd hour, he had killed 19 Draxians and saved countless human lives with his raids. Kethvor watched Katie Reyes coordinate the defense from the church. She had taken a plasma burn to her left arm during the opening exchange, but she refused medical treatment. The wound was severe. Her flesh was blackened and blistered. A normal person would have been screaming in pain. Katie simply wrapped it in bandages and kept giving orders. Her voice was calm as she directed defenders to new positions. She tracked enemy movements on a crude map and predicted where they would attack next. She was right almost every time. When a Draxian force tried to flank the eastern barricade, Katie had already positioned a team there to meet them. When another force pushed toward the medical station, human fighters emerged from hiding and cut them down. The Draxians were becoming frustrated. They had never faced resistance like this. The species they conquered usually fell apart under pressure. Their civilians cowered and their soldiers fled, but these humans did not cower. They did not flee. They stood and fought with a fury that bordered on madness. Vexwrath called for reinforcements from the ships. He sent another 2,000 warriors to the surface, more than doubling his ground force. The fresh troops pushed into the colony from multiple directions, overwhelming the human defenders with sheer numbers. The humans fell back to their secondary positions. They moved through buildings and alleys, firing as they went. Every corridor became a death trap. Every doorway held a defender who would rather die than retreat. An older woman named Beth Crawford, a retired nurse, held a choke point for 20 minutes with nothing but a hunting rifle and 2 pistols. She killed 11 Draxians before running out of ammunition. When they finally reached her position, they found her waiting with a knife. She wounded 2 more before they killed her. Kethvor noticed something in her eyes as she died. It was not fear. It was satisfaction. She had bought time for others to escape and fortify new positions. Her death had meaning, and she knew it. The humans seemed to understand something that other species did not. They knew they could not win this battle through strength alone. The Draxians were bigger, stronger, and more numerous. But the humans could make them pay for every step forward. They could bleed them with every advance. They could turn this invasion into a nightmare. Ryan Costa made his final attack near the end of the 6th hour. His team had been reduced to 3 survivors, all of them wounded. They had run out of ammunition hours ago and had been scavenging from fallen Draxians. Ryan had a plan, but he knew it would be his last. The Draxians had established a command post in a captured warehouse. Officers gathered there to coordinate the assault and treat their wounded. It was the heart of their ground operation. Ryan led his team through the maintenance tunnels beneath the building, carrying every explosive they had left. They emerged in the basement, directly below the command post. Draxian warriors spotted them immediately and opened fire. Ryan's 2 companions fell, cut down by plasma bolts. Ryan kept running. Bolts burned past his head and scorched his back. He reached the support column at the center of the building and pressed himself against it. He triggered the explosives. The blast killed 40 Draxians instantly, including 3 senior officers. The building collapsed into rubble, burying dozens more. The shock wave damaged nearby structures and threw the Draxian assault into chaos for precious minutes. Ryan Costa did not survive. He had known he would not survive when he volunteered for the mission. He had smiled when Katie asked if he was sure. He told her that someone had to do it, and he was already wounded anyway. Might as well make it count. Kethavor sat in his observation post with his recording device forgotten in his lap. He had seen courage before. He had documented last stands across the galaxy, but he had never seen anything like this. These humans were not fighting to survive. They were fighting to hurt their enemies, to make them suffer, to leave scars that would last for generations. The Draxians captured the 1st district after 6 hours of continuous combat. They had expected to secure the entire colony in 30 minutes. Their casualties had already exceeded 500 dead and many more wounded. Vexarath stood among the bodies of his warriors and felt something he had not experienced in decades of conquest. He felt doubt. These humans were supposed to be weak. They were supposed to break. Instead, they had turned his invasion into a grinding horror that consumed his soldiers by the dozens. He looked toward the inner districts where the surviving humans had retreated. Fires burned in the ruins. Smoke filled the air. Somewhere in that hell, a few hundred civilians were preparing to fight to the last breath. Vexarath gave the order to continue the assault. He had come too far to retreat. His reputation would not survive abandoning a campaign against primitive colonists. He would crush these humans no matter the cost. But as his warriors advanced into the smoke and fire, Vexarath felt a chill run through his armored body. He was beginning to understand that the cost might be higher than he had ever imagined. The humans were not defending their homes anymore. They were hunting Draxians, and they were very, very good at it. The 2nd day of the battle began with rain. Cold water fell from gray skies onto the ruins of New Haven, mixing with blood and ash to create rivers of mud that ran through the shattered streets. The Draxians had committed their entire ground force to the assault, and still the humans held. Jake Morrison had taken 3 wounds during the night fighting. A plasma bolt had burned his shoulder. Shrapnel had torn his leg. A Draxian blade had opened a gash across his chest. He refused to go to the medical station. There were others who needed treatment more than him. He wrapped his wounds with torn cloth and returned to the barricades with his grandfather's rifle in his hands. The humans had been pushed back to the inner districts. Their original force of 300 fighters had been reduced to less than 100. But those 100 were the hardest, the most determined, the ones who had survived the worst fighting and emerged with cold fire in their eyes. Katie Reyes was still alive, though she moved more slowly now. Her burned arm had become infected, and fever was spreading through her body. She ignored it. She had work to do. She had people to protect. She could rest when she was dead. The humans had learned to use everything as a weapon. They collapsed buildings onto advancing Draxians. They set fires that spread through entire blocks, forcing the enemy to fight through walls of flame. They poisoned their own water supplies, knowing the Draxians would try to use them. They booby-trapped their own dead, turning fallen friends into explosive traps. Kethvor watched a teenage girl named Amy Vance, barely 16 years old, lure a squad of Draxian warriors into a basement. She had told them through a translator that she wanted to surrender, that she would show them where others were hiding. The Draxians followed her down the stairs, already celebrating another easy capture. Amy led them to the center of the basement, where she had spent the previous night stacking every flammable material she could find. She looked at the warriors surrounding her and smiled. Then she struck a match. The explosion killed 8 Draxians. Amy did not survive. She had never intended to survive. Vexarath received the casualty reports in his command ship above the planet. His ground force had suffered over 2,000 dead and wounded. 2,000 of his finest warriors, lost to a rabble of farmers and shopkeepers armed with primitive weapons. The other species under his command were beginning to whisper. How could the mighty Draxians struggle against such weak prey? He made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered his ships to begin orbital bombardment of the colony. The first plasma strikes hit the outer ruins, turning rubble into glass. The Draxian warships rained fire from the sky, destroying everything in their path. Vexarath planned to level the entire colony and kill every human inside. If he could not conquer them, he would annihilate them. Jake Morrison watched the bombardment from his position and knew they had only minutes left. The Draxians would systematically destroy every building until nothing remained. All their fighting, all their sacrifice would mean nothing. Then he heard the sound of engines. 5 small ships rose from hidden hangars on the edge of the colony. They were patrol vessels, barely armed, designed for cargo runs and light escort duties. They had no weapons capable of threatening a Draxian warship. Their pilots were civilians who had been flying supply routes a week ago, but they were flying now, climbing through the rain and smoke toward the enemy fleet. Kethvor's sensors tracked the human ships as they gained altitude. He calculated their trajectory and felt confusion. They were flying directly toward the Draxian formation. They had no weapons that could penetrate warship armor. What were they doing? The lead pilot was a man named Scott Ellis. He was 35 years old. He had a wife and 2 children in the colony below. He had kissed them goodbye that morning and told them he loved them. Then he had walked to his ship and begun the startup sequence. His co-pilot was a woman named Nicole Gray. She was 22 and had just earned her pilot certification 3 months ago. She had volunteered for this mission because she was the best pilot they had. She did not expect to see the sunset. The Draxian fleet opened fire on the approaching human ships. Plasma bolts streaked through the atmosphere, lighting up the sky like lightning. 2 of the human vessels exploded in the first volley. Their pilots killed instantly. The remaining 3 kept coming. Scott Ellis pushed his engines beyond their rated limits. Warning lights flashed across his console. The hull groaned under the stress. Nicole sat beside him, her hands steady on the controls, her face calm. They reached the Draxian formation and split apart, each ship targeting a different warship. The Draxians poured fire into them, but at close range, the small ships were hard to track. Scott's vessel took hit after hit, losing systems, trailing smoke and flame. He aimed his ship at the nearest bombardment vessel and activated the emergency reactor overload. The explosion was visible from the surface. Scott Ellis and his small patrol ship became a ball of nuclear fire that engulfed the Draxian warship completely. The larger vessel's shields failed under the massive energy release. Its hull cracked and broke apart. Secondary explosions ripped through its decks as ammunition and fuel ignited. Nicole Gray hit her target 3 seconds later. Her ship was already falling apart when she triggered the overload. She thought of her parents back on Earth as the light consumed her. She hoped they would be proud. The third pilot, a quiet man named Luis Mendez, who had never spoken more than 10 words at a time, destroyed 2 warships with his sacrifice. His vessel had penetrated deep into the formation before detonating, and the blast caught a second ship in its radius. 3 human pilots, 5 small civilian ships, 9 Draxian warships destroyed. Kethvor stared at his screens in silence. His hands trembled. His hearts beat too fast. He had documented hundreds of battles, but he had never seen anything like this. These humans had flown to certain death without hesitation. They had smiled as they climbed into their ships. They had sacrificed themselves to protect people they would never see again. The bombardment stopped. The Draxian fleet pulled back, their formation shattered, their confidence broken. Vexarath stood on his command deck and stared at the burning wreckage of his ships. He had lost 9 warships to 3 suicide attacks. His fleet had been cut nearly in half. On the surface below, the surviving humans watched the fires in the sky and wept. They wept for the pilots who had saved them. They wept for everyone they had lost. Then they dried their tears and returned to their positions. The battle was not over yet. The battle for New Haven lasted 6 days. On the 3rd day, the Draxians launched a massive assault with every warrior they had left. They pushed through the human defenses block by block, paying for each meter with blood. The humans retreated to the central square, the same place where Jake Morrison had asked for volunteers just days before. Less than 60 defenders remained, most of them wounded, all of them exhausted. Katie Reyes died on the 4th day. She had led a counterattack against a Draxian breakthrough, charging into the enemy with nothing but a rifle and a knife. Her burned arm had stopped working hours before, but she fought with one hand and refused to fall. She killed 11 Draxians before they finally brought her down. Even then, she managed to trigger a grenade with her dying breath, taking 3 more enemies with her. Jake Morrison found her body after the fighting moved on. He knelt beside her in the mud and closed her eyes. He did not cry. He had no tears left. He simply picked up her rifle and returned to the barricades. On the 5th day, the Draxians tried to negotiate. Vexarath broadcast an offer of safe passage for any human who surrendered. He promised that those who laid down their weapons would be treated well and eventually returned to human space. It was a lie, and everyone knew it was a lie. But Vexarath hoped that exhaustion and despair might make the humans believe. No one surrendered, not a single person. Jake Morrison broadcast his response in a voice raw from smoke and exhaustion. He told Vexarath that they would fight until no human remained standing. He told him that for every human the Draxians killed, they would pay 10 of their own. He told him that this colony would become a graveyard for any enemy who set foot on its soil. Then he returned to fighting. The final assault came on the 6th day. The Draxians had lost over 3,000 warriors and had only a few hundred left. Their remaining warships had pulled back to the edge of the system, damaged and demoralized. But Vexarath could not retreat. His honor, his career, his very identity demanded that he crush these humans. He led the assault personally. He marched through the ruined streets with his warriors, stepping over the bodies of the fallen, both Draxian and human. The central square was just ahead. A handful of humans waited behind their final barricade. Jake Morrison stood at the center of the defense. He had run out of ammunition hours ago. His grandfather's rifle was empty and broken. He held only a machete that he had taken from a supply shed. Beside him stood 14 survivors, farmers and teachers and engineers, an old man named Pete Dawson who had promised to die well, a teenage boy named Chris Porter who had lied about his age to join the Defenders, a pregnant woman named Megan Torres who refused to hide in the shelter with the children. The Draxians charged. The humans met them. Jake Morrison killed 3 warriors before they brought him down. He was still swinging his machete when he died, still fighting, still refusing to surrender. His body fell among his enemies, surrounded by those he had killed. Pete Dawson kept his promise. He died well, his ancient shotgun empty, his hands around a Draxian throat. Chris Porter fell protecting Megan Torres, buying her time to retreat to the shelter. Megan made it to the door and turned to face the enemy. She had no weapon left. She stood in the doorway and spread her arms, blocking the entrance with her body. A Draxian warrior raised his weapon to kill her. The relief fleet arrived. 6 human warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system. They were proper military vessels, heavily armed, crewed by trained soldiers. They had been traveling at maximum speed since receiving the colony's distress signal. They were too late to save Jake Morrison and Katie Reyes and so many others. But they were not too late to save the survivors. The human warships engaged the Draxian fleet immediately. In their weakened state, the remaining Draxian vessels could not fight. Vexarath ordered a full retreat. His ships fled toward the edge of the system, pursued by human fighters. On the surface, the surviving Draxian warriors found themselves surrounded. Human soldiers dropped from the sky in landing craft, weapons blazing. The warriors who had terrorized 100 worlds suddenly understood what it felt like to be prey. 300 Draxian warriors surrendered. The rest died fighting or fleeing. When the shooting stopped, the humans began counting their dead. Of the 12,000 colonists who had lived in New Haven, 8,000 had perished. The colony was in ruins. Entire districts had been flattened by orbital bombardment or destroyed in the fighting. It would take years to rebuild, but they had won. Megan Torres gave birth to a healthy daughter 3 months later. She named her Katie, after the woman who had given everything to protect the colony. The child would grow up hearing stories of the battle, learning the names of those who had died so that others might live. Kethavor transmitted his final report to the Valanthi High Council from his observation post. His hands still trembled as he recorded his assessment. He had been asked to evaluate whether humans posed a threat to the hegemony. His answer was unlike anything he had written in 40 cycles of service. He told the council that humans should never be engaged in combat. He told them that humans should never be threatened or provoked. He explained what he had witnessed, the impossible courage, the terrifying determination, the willingness to die for strangers and principles and things that other species could barely understand. Kethavor wrote that the Draxians had come to Kepler 442b expecting a massacre. They had been correct. They had simply misunderstood who would be massacred. He described how 12,000 civilians with primitive weapons and no military training had inflicted 90% casualties on a professional invasion force. He described how humans had sacrificed themselves without hesitation, not in despair, but with calculated purpose. He described how they had smiled as they died, knowing their deaths would cost the enemy dearly. Kethavor concluded his report with a warning. Humans, he wrote, were not like other species. They did not fight to survive. Something in their nature compelled them to resist with a ferocity that defied analysis. They had spent their entire evolutionary history learning to kill anything that threatened them. They had faced predators and plagues and disasters that would have ended weaker species, and they had survived. They had always survived. They were not prey. They were not soldiers. They were something far more dangerous. They were survivors, and they would never stop fighting. Kethavor ended his report with a single request. He asked to be reassigned to non-human observation duties immediately. He had seen enough. The Valanthi High Council read his report in silence. They looked at each other across the chamber. And then, without discussion, they voted unanimously to establish peaceful relations with humanity. Some enemies were not worth making.